My name is Walter Brennan. I'm 71 years old, and last Thursday, I finally stopped being the cash machine my own son installed in his guest bedroom. At 9 in the morning, I walked into a credit union 3 towns over and quietly rerouted my entire Social Security and naval pension to a brand new account my son didn't know existed. By noon, my son's wife was pounding on the door of the converted garage I'd been calling home for 2 years, screaming that her husband had just been declined at a furniture store with my debit card. I poured a second cup of coffee, looked her right in the face, and said one sentence that turned her skin the color of cold oatmeal. Before I tell you what that sentence was, do me a favor and drop the city you're listening from in the comments. Hit subscribe if you believe a man who built his own house with his own hands shouldn't have to ask permission to buy a hamburger. Now let me back up. The screen door rattled so hard the spring jumped off its hook and landed in the dirt outside. My daughter-in-law came in first. I'll call her by what she is, my son's wife, because the word daughter-in-law always made me feel like I owed her something. She had her phone in one hand and a lipstick mark on her front tooth, and she was already yelling before she finished crossing the linoleum. My son followed her in 2 steps behind, in the same khaki pants he'd been wearing for 3 days. He slammed his palm down on my kitchen table hard enough to knock my reading glasses sideways. He said the card had been swallowed at the register. He said the salesman at the showroom had stood there, in front of his wife and his wife's sister, and explained loudly that the account had been reported as compromised. He told me he'd never been so humiliated in his entire life, and that I needed to get on the phone with the bank right now and fix it. I drank my coffee. I didn't say anything. I let him keep going until his wife had to grab his elbow because his neck was turning that ugly shade of red his father used to get before a stroke. Then I set my mug down on the saucer the way my own father taught me to, gentle, no clatter, and I asked her one question. I asked her what I'd had for supper the night before. She blinked. She looked at my son. My son looked at the floor. She finally said something about leftover lasagna. I stood up from my chair, took the 4 steps to the little half fridge they'd bought me from a yard sale, and I opened it. Inside was half a tub of cottage cheese with a pull date from October, a heel of bread going green at the edges, and 3 slices of bologna in a sandwich bag. I closed the door and turned around. I told them my naval pension and my Social Security together deposited a little over $4,800 into that joint account every single month. I told them I'd watched for 2 solid years that money disappear within 48 hours of every deposit. I told them I knew about the base boat. I knew about the trip to Cabo last March that they took without telling me. I knew about the leather sectional that arrived in the main house the same week my son's wife told me they couldn't afford to fix the leak in my ceiling. I asked her if cottage cheese and bologna was what $4,800 looked like, because if it was, somebody owed the United States Navy a refund. My son rolled his eyes. I want you to picture this, because it matters. A grown man, 44 years old, rolling his eyes at his own father the way a teenager rolls them at a curfew. He told me I was being dramatic. He said I didn't even need money out here, because what was I going to spend it on? More crossword books? He said they were doing me a favor, letting me live on the property. And if I was going to get worked up about a few groceries, he was going to call my doctor and have my blood pressure checked. That was when I reached down beside the table and picked up the accordion folder I'd had ready since 6 that morning. I'd bought it at the office supply store the week prior, the kind with the elastic strap. I dropped it on the table between his hands. The thud was loud in that little kitchen. I told him to open it. Inside was every bank statement going back 26 months. Every charge highlighted in 3 different colors. Yellow for things I knew about. Pink for things I didn't. Green for things that were so brazen I'd had to sit down on the toilet lid and breathe for a minute when I first found them. The 4-night stay at a resort in Sedona while I was in the hospital with pneumonia. The $500 dinner at a steakhouse on the same Saturday his wife told me she couldn't drive me to my cataract appointment because she was swamped with work. The down payment on a side-by-side ATV that I had never sat in, never seen, and was apparently registered in my son's name. I didn't yell. I read it out loud. Date, dollar amount, vendor. Like a notary. My son's wife started to cry around the 3rd page, but they weren't real tears. They were the kind women learn to produce when they need a man to back off. And I'd been married for 41 years to a real woman, so I knew the difference. I kept reading. When I got to the end, I closed the folder and told them the gravy train had been disconnected at the source. The new account was in my name only. They would never see another dollar of it, and they had until the end of the week to figure out how to live on what my son actually earned, which, based on the deposits I'd seen come through, was not very much. I expected my son to break. I'd been bracing for it. He was always the kind of kid who cried when he got caught, even when he was little. I figured he'd put his head in his hands and start with the apologies and the promises. I had a whole speech ready for that, about how forgiveness wasn't a refund, about how I loved him, but I was done being his ATM. I never got to use that speech. Because instead, my son reached into the inside pocket of his Carhartt jacket and pulled out an envelope of his own. He slid it across the table on top of mine. He didn't say anything for a minute. He just looked at me with an expression I'd seen on his face exactly twice before in his life. Once when he was 17 and totaled my truck, and once when he was 26 and told me his first wife had left him. It was the look of a man who has already decided to do something terrible and is now just waiting for permission from the room. He told me to open it. It was a petition, drafted by a lawyer in the next county over. It was an emergency motion for guardianship, the legal term for taking a parent's rights away on the grounds that the parent can no longer manage their own affairs. Stapled to the back was a sworn statement from a doctor I had never met in my life, describing a series of office visits I had never attended, in which I had supposedly demonstrated confusion, paranoid ideation, inability to track a conversation, and what the doctor called concerning fixations on financial matters consistent with early onset cognitive decline. My son's wife straightened up. The fake tears dried up real fast. She told me, in the soft voice she used when she wanted something, that they hadn't wanted it to come to this. She said they'd been worried about me for a long time. She said the way I'd been obsessing over the bank statements lately was just one more sign. She said a judge would look at my age, look at the doctor's signature, and make them my legal guardians by the end of next week. Then they'd sort the account out properly. Then I could rest. My son tapped the envelope. He told me I had until Monday to hand him the new card and the PIN. If I did, the petition would stay in his glove box and we'd never speak of it again. If I didn't, he'd file it Monday morning. And by Tuesday afternoon, I'd be in a county facility with a plastic bracelet around my wrist, while a judge decided how the rest of my life was going to go. They walked out. They didn't fix the door. The spring was still in the dirt. My son's wife slammed what was left of the screen so hard a piece of the frame split. I sat at that table for a long time. I'm not going to lie to you and say I was calm. I wasn't. My hands were shaking around the mug, and there was a sound in my ears like the inside of a seashell. My wife had been gone 4 years that April. If she'd been alive, none of this would have happened because she'd raised that boy and she would have known how to talk to him. I didn't. I never had. I was the one who taught him to change his oil and the one who taught him to shoot. And somewhere in there, I'd missed teaching him the only thing that mattered, which was that you don't steal from the people who love you. But I want to tell you something about me you need to know, or none of the rest of this will make sense. I spent 31 years in the United States Navy. I retired as senior chief. My specialty wasn't combat. My specialty was forensic accounting for the Office of Naval Investigations. For 3 decades, my entire job was finding out where the money went when somebody on a base or a ship said it had gone somewhere it hadn't. I taught classes on it at the War College for 6 years before I hung it up. My son knew what I'd done for a living. He'd just forgotten. The way kids forget that their parents existed before they did. And the second he slid that envelope across my table, I stopped being his father. Not in my heart. In my heart, I'll always be his father. But in the part of my brain that handles operations, I locked that door and I became a forensic investigator looking at a subject. Because here's the thing he had not thought through. A man does not pay a doctor to forge a dementia diagnosis on his own father just to control a $4,000 pension. The math doesn't work. The risk-to-reward ratio of forging a federal medical document is catastrophically bad if all you're chasing is grocery money. He was after something bigger. He had to be. And whatever it was, he'd already done it. And the guardianship petition was the cleanup, not the heist. I picked up the phone and called the man I served with for 11 years, a JAG officer named, well, I'll just say he was the kind of lawyer who'd retired into private practice and specialized in elder financial abuse because he'd watched it happen to his own mother. I'll call him my attorney. I told him in 3 sentences what had happened. He told me to be in his office in 90 minutes and not to talk to anyone else, including the bank, until I got there. I drove the 2 hours into the city. His office was on the 8th floor of a building that smelled like old paper and good coffee. He was waiting at the door. I handed him the envelope. He read the petition standing up, didn't even sit down, and when he got to the doctor's affidavit, he made a small noise in his throat like he'd bitten into a lemon. He told me to sit. He told his secretary to clear his afternoon. He told me that in our state, a judge could grant emergency temporary guardianship in 24 hours on a doctor's letter alone, without me ever being in the room. And that once that order was signed, my son would have legal authority over every account, every asset, every piece of mail with my name on it, until I could prove in a hearing 30 to 90 days later that I was competent. 30 to 90 days, he said, during which my son would have full control. And if he was running a scheme, he could move a lot of money in 30 days. Then my attorney swiveled his computer monitor around and pulled up the county property records. I want you to understand something. The house I lived in, the main house where my son and his wife and their 2 kids lived now, the house I'd built from a foundation up with my own 2 hands the year I retired, that house was in my name. Free and clear. No mortgage. I'd paid cash from the lump sum I took when I left the service, plus my wife's small inheritance from her aunt. When my son got divorced from his first wife and ended up on my couch 8 years ago, I told him he and the new woman could have the main house and I'd take the converted garage. I never put his name on the deed. My wife, before she died, had been very firm about that. She loved our son, but she said she didn't trust that woman further than she could throw her. I'd promised her I'd keep the house in my name only. It was one of the last promises I made to her, and I'd kept it. My attorney typed in the parcel number. The page loaded. He scrolled down to the section that lists encumbrances. And he went very still. There was a lien on my house, filed 11 weeks ago. The lender was a private mortgage company I'd never heard of. The amount was $420,000. I felt something cold start at the back of my neck and run down my spine like ice water out of a tap. I leaned forward in the chair. My attorney clicked on the document. It was a home equity loan agreement. 40 pages. He scrolled to the signature page, and there, on the line marked Purporty O.W. near, was my name, Walter James Brennan, in handwriting. It wasn't my handwriting. I want to tell you how I knew. I kept a logbook every day of my naval career, and after I retired I kept a journal because my wife had asked me to. I had 31 volumes of my own handwriting on a shelf in my bedroom. My W is distinctive. I crossed it at the bottom because I'd been taught to in grade school 1962 by a teacher who was a stickler. The W on that document had no cross. The signature was someone trying to copy a signature they'd seen, but they hadn't grown up with my 3rd grade teacher. My son had borrowed $420,000 against my house, using a forged signature, 11 weeks ago. The money had already been dispersed. My attorney pulled the loan history. The funds had gone to an LLC. The LLC was registered to my son's wife's brother. From there, my attorney couldn't see, but he could guess, and so could I. They'd laundered it. It was probably already gone, and every month the loan was costing somebody $2,600 in interest, which was not being paid, because I just shut off the only steady income they'd been using to make payments on it. The bank was about to send a notice of default to me, the legal property owner, and when I got that notice, I would discover the loan and the whole scheme would come apart. Unless, before that letter arrived, somebody had become my legal guardian, because then they could intercept my mail, default on the loan deliberately, let the house go into foreclosure, and walk away clean while the bank seized my house to cover their losses. I would be in a facility somewhere with a plastic bracelet. My son and his wife would be in a rental somewhere, broke but free, and the $420,000 would be wherever the LLC had moved it. That was why he looked at me the way he did across the table that morning. He wasn't bluffing about the guardianship, he needed it. My attorney didn't waste time being shocked. He'd seen this before. He told me 3 things. First, we needed to get me in front of a state-licensed geriatric psychiatrist today if possible for a full cognitive evaluation, so that if my son filed Monday, we'd have an unimpeachable medical record dated before the petition. Second, we needed to file a police report on the forged loan documents that afternoon, because forgery on a federally regulated mortgage is a federal crime. And once the FBI's name was on the file, no county judge in the state was going to grant an emergency guardianship to the man under federal investigation. Third, we needed to put a hold on the property title with the recorder's office, so my son couldn't sell, transfer, or further encumber the house while we worked. He made the calls. By 4 that afternoon, I was sitting in a windowless office in a memory clinic affiliated with the state university, taking a 4-hour battery of tests from a woman with steel gray hair and a name tag that said she was board certified in geriatric neuropsychology. She had me draw clocks. She had me remember word lists and recall them after distractions. She had me do serial subtractions and explain proverbs and identify objects from incomplete drawings. About 2 hours in, she set down her clipboard and asked me, conversationally, what I'd done for a living. When I told her, she smiled for the first time, made a note, and said the next part was going to be more interesting for her than for me. At the end, she told me, on the record, that I was in the top 2% of cognitive function for my age cohort she had ever evaluated. She typed up a 4-page report and signed it under penalty of perjury before I left the building. By 6 that evening, my attorney had filed the police report and the title hold. The federal forgery referral would go in Monday morning, which was, conveniently, the day my son was planning to file his petition. I drove home in the dark. I parked the truck in the gravel beside the converted garage. The lights were on in the main house. I could see my son and his wife at the kitchen table through the window, eating something out of takeout containers. They had no idea where I'd been all day. I think they'd assumed I'd spent it crying or calling some old Navy buddy to whine. I didn't go inside the main house. I went into the converted garage. I made myself a cheese sandwich and I sat at my own little table and I ate it slowly, and I thought about my wife. I thought about what she would have said. I thought she would have told me to be careful, but she also would have told me to do exactly what I was doing because she had not raised her son to become a thief. And if he had become one anyway, then he had to face the consequences like a man. She used to say that. Face it like a man. She didn't have patience for excuses, even from her own boy. The next morning was Friday. My attorney called me at 7. The Federal Task Force on Mortgage Fraud had pulled the file overnight and was very interested. They wanted to interview me Monday. They also wanted to interview the loan officer at the private mortgage company, the notary whose stamp was on the document, and my son's wife's brother who owned the LLC. My attorney told me that as of Monday morning, the people in the main house were going to have a very different week than they'd been planning. But there was one more thing, and this is the part I have to tell you carefully, because it's the part the comments on the last video I watched got mad about, and I want you to understand my reasoning before you judge. My son's 2 kids, my grandkids, were 8 and 10. They lived in that main house. Whatever I did to my son and his wife was going to land on those 2 children. I sat on the porch of the converted garage Friday morning with a cup of coffee, and I thought about that for a long time. My granddaughter, the 10-year-old, she'd come out to the garage every Saturday morning since she could walk, and we'd done crossword puzzles together. She didn't know any of this. She didn't deserve any of it, so I called my attorney back, and I asked him to set up a separate trust, funded out of my own money, not the stolen money, my money, that would cover the kids' school clothes, their dental, their Christmases, and a college fund for each of them, administered by a third-party trustee, completely outside the reach of either parent. I told him I wanted the paperwork drawn up by Sunday. He told me it would be. Then I called my late wife's sister, my sister-in-law who lived 2 states over. I'll call her my wife's sister. She was 68, widowed, retired school teacher, and she had loved those kids since the day they were born. I told her what was happening. I told her I might need her to come stay for a while. She was on the road within the hour. Saturday, I worked. I packed the things in the converted garage that mattered to me. The journals. My wife's wedding ring on the chain I'd been wearing since the funeral. The flag from her father's casket. My service photos. The wooden chest I'd built for our first anniversary. Things that were mine. I loaded them into the bed of the truck under a tarp. I left the furniture, the dishes, the television, the recliner. None of it mattered. I was going to disappear from that property by Tuesday morning, one way or another, and I wanted the things that mattered to be where they couldn't be touched. Sunday afternoon, my son came down to the garage. I think he'd noticed the truck sitting low. He sat at my table and he tried, for the first time in 2 years, to be charming. He told me he knew this had all gotten out of hand. He said his wife was under a lot of pressure. He said maybe we could sit down, the 3 of us, and rework the budget together. He said the petition didn't have to get filed if we could just talk. He smiled at me. It was the smile he'd had when he was 9 years old asking for a dirt bike for his birthday. I poured him a cup of coffee. I sat down across from him, and I asked him about the LLC. The smile didn't drop all at once. It went away in stages. First his eyes, then the corners of his mouth, then his whole face went smooth and blank. The way a man's face goes when he realizes the room is no longer the room he thought he was in. I told him I knew about the $420,000. I told him I knew about his wife's brother. I told him I'd had my signature analyzed by a forensic document examiner my attorney had on retainer, and the report would be on a federal investigator's desk by lunchtime Monday. I told him the title to the house was frozen, and the cognitive evaluation in my file was so good the state university was probably going to use it as a teaching example for the next 10 years. I told him the petition he had in his glove box wouldn't survive a phone call to my doctor. He sat there. He didn't get up. He didn't yell. Eventually, he asked me what I wanted. I told him I wanted 3 things. I wanted his wife packed and out of my main house by sundown. I told him she could go to her brother's since they were business partners now anyway. I wanted my son to surrender himself to the federal investigators Monday morning at 9, voluntarily, with my attorney present, because cooperation would be the only thing standing between him and a sentence in the double digits. And I wanted him to sign, that night, an affidavit acknowledging the forgery and naming everyone involved, which my attorney had already drawn up and which was sitting in a folder under my coffee mug. I told him in exchange for those 3 things, I would do 2 things for him. I would not pursue civil damages, which meant his future earnings would not be garnished for the rest of his life. And I would make sure his children were taken care of, regardless of where he ended up, because they were innocent and they were mine. I would not, however, lie for him. I would not minimize what he had done. He was going to take the consequences like a man, the way his mother had raised him to. And he was never, ever going to live under a roof of mine again. He cried. I'll tell you that. He put his head down on the table and he cried the way he'd cried when he was 9 and the dog died. I didn't touch him. I didn't get up. I sat there until he was finished, and then I slid the affidavit across, and I gave him my pen. He signed it. His wife had not come down to the garage with him. He told me she'd been packing a bag since noon. She knew. She'd known since Friday night that something was wrong because the loan officer at the mortgage company had been ducking her calls. She left around 7 that evening. She didn't say goodbye to me. She didn't say goodbye to her own children. She loaded a Honda Civic with 3 suitcases and a dog crate, and she drove out the gravel drive, and she has not, as of the day I'm telling you this, contacted any of us since. The federal investigators picked her up 6 weeks later in Florida. Her brother had already flipped on her. The LLC money had been moved through 2 more shells before being parked in a brokerage account, and the brokerage account was in her name only, not her brother's, not my son's. She had been planning to leave my son the whole time. He had not known that. I think that hurt him more than any of the rest of it. My son did surrender Monday morning. He served 18 months in a federal facility for wire fraud and forgery, plus 3 years of supervised release. The mortgage loan was unwound by the federal court because the underlying signature was fraudulent. The bank ate the loss, which my attorney told me was rare but possible when the fraud is documented as cleanly as ours was. My house came off the lien within 6 months. My grandkids stayed with my wife's sister in the main house while my son was away. I paid her a salary, which she didn't want to accept until I told her it was what my wife would have wanted, and then she did. I moved out of the converted garage the Tuesday after that Sunday. I didn't go far. I bought a small ranch house about 40 minutes east on a piece of land with an apple orchard somebody had let go feral. I spend my mornings out there with pruners. The grandkids come on weekends. My granddaughter still does crosswords with me, although now we do them in the kitchen of the new house, and she's gotten good enough that she finishes the across clues before I do. My son got out 2 months ago. He lives in a sober living apartment downtown and works at a cabinet shop. He calls every Sunday. We talk for about 10 minutes. We don't talk about what happened. I don't know if we ever will. I told him at the start when he got out that I loved him and I had always loved him and I always would love him, but he was not moving back onto my property ever, and he was not getting another dollar from me beyond the trust I'd set up for the kids. He said he understood. I think he might actually. He's older now. Prison ages a man. I want to tell you what I learned, because the comments on these videos always ask, and I think it's the only part of the story that matters in the long run. I learned that I had been trying to buy my son's affection for 2 years by letting him take from me because I was afraid that if I cut him off, I'd lose him entirely. I learned that I had already lost him. The version of him I was paying for didn't exist. He'd been a thief the whole time I was funding him, and pretending otherwise wasn't love, it was cowardice on my part. Real love would have put a stop to it the first month. Real love would have told him no. I learned that being old is not the same as being weak. Those are 2 different things. And the people who count on you for getting the difference are exactly the people you cannot afford to have close to you. I learned that a man who served his country for 31 years and built his own house with his own 2 hands does not owe anyone an apology for protecting what he built. Not even his own son. Especially not his own son. If you've made it this far, and any of this sounds like your own life, I want you to do one thing for me. Pull a bank statement. Just one. Read it line by line. If something on it doesn't make sense, don't let anyone tell you you're imagining it. Don't let anyone tell you you're confused. You're not confused. You're just finally paying attention. And paying attention, at our age, is the most powerful thing we have left. Hit subscribe if a man's pension belongs to the man who earned it. Tell me in the comments what city you're listening from, and tell me one thing your kids never figured out about you. I read everyone. I'll see you next time. Sitting on the porch of the new ranch house this past Sunday, watching my granddaughter chase a barn cat through the apple trees, I thought about the chain of choices that had landed me there. Not landed me, exactly. Carried me. Because that's what choices do, one after another, like stones laid down in a creek bed until you've made yourself a path you can stand on. I had been a coward for 2 years. I want to be honest about that. Every month that money disappeared from the joint account and I said nothing. I was choosing my son's comfort over my own dignity. And I told myself I was being a good father. I wasn't. I was being a frightened one. Fear and love are not the same thing. And I'd been mixing them up since the day my wife passed and left me alone with a grown man I didn't know how to talk to anymore. The cottage cheese in that little half fridge wasn't put there by my son. It was put there by my own silence. What I learned, and what I want to leave you with, is that every consequence in this story was earned. Mine, my son's, his wife's, all of it. He forged my signature because he believed I was too tired and too lonely to check. He was right about the lonely to check. He was right about the lonely part. He was wrong about the rest. His wife planned to leave him with the money because she had watched him take from his own father, and she correctly understood that a man who steals from his blood will not protect a stranger. My grandkids ended up in my wife's sister's care because I finally, after 2 years, decided that loving them meant building a wall their parents could not climb. Cause and effect. The universe keeps its books. It doesn't keep them quickly, and it doesn't keep them fairly in the short run, but it keeps them. I want you to understand 3 things if you take nothing else from a man my age telling his story to a camera. The first is that being a decent person is not a passive condition. Decency is something you have to enforce, including against the people you love most, because the world will test it and so will they. The second is that your mind is the one thing nobody can mortgage without your permission. And you should keep it sharp the way a carpenter keeps his saw, every day, on purpose. Read the statement, open the envelope, ask the question even when you're tired. The third is that strength at our age does not look like shouting. It looks like sitting at a kitchen table with your hands folded while the people who underestimated you discover one by one what they walked into. My son calls me on Sundays now. He's a different man than the one who slid that envelope across my table. And the only reason he's a different man is because someone, finally, refused to fund the worst version of him. That refusal was the most loving thing I have ever done for him in 44 years. I should have done it sooner. I'm doing it now. And every morning I wake up in a quiet house I'd built myself, with apple trees outside the window and my wife's wedding ring still around my neck, and I am not lonely anymore. I'm just alone. There's a tremendous difference between those 2 words, and I hope you live long enough to learn it the easy way.